we're here with Tom Welsh, historian and author of many books on local history.
And co-author, right.
And co-author.
I don't want to diss my co-authors.
No, nobody's dissing anybody. So I wanted to start off talking about breweries. The history of breweries in the Valley. It's
right.
October.
Right.
I know that actual Oktoberfest actually begins in September in Munich, Germany, but it's October. It's a good time for beers, lots of seasonal beers. It's a good beer season. And we've actually got quite a bit of brewing activity.
Yes.
Craft breweries for the past 10 years or so have been exploding all over the country, and certainly in this region. We've got the Penguin City Brewery that just opened up over there, so a lot of brewery stuff happening. But I wanted to talk about the history of brewing in the area, which actually goes back all the way to the 1800s. Can you talk a little bit about that?
And I know primarily about the Renner Brewery and its predecessor, the City Brewery. There were a number of breweries in Youngstown at one time. We had up to 3 operating at one time during the 1800s. But
so brewing is not new to this area.
No, and
people have been ingesting alcohol since pretty much as early as they could.
Absolutely, and we did have
throughout the world.
We did have a small but vibrant German-American population, as reflected in the fact that there was a Lutheran church in Briar Hill. Mm-hmm. There was a German National Catholic parish that was across the street from Reuben Macmillan Library. That later became the Newman Center. I think that's how most people knew the building later. And some of the pillars of the German community belonged to that church, by the way, including the Renners. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so the story of the Renner Brewery.
Now that was, I believe, the longest running brewery
the Renners
in the city of Youngstown.
The Renner name is the one people know when they think of local beer. That's the one that is within living memory, I guess you could say.
I had never heard of it until I started looking into it.
Right. Yeah. Well, it depends on how long you've been living.
Right.
But yeah, generally anything that happened after World War II, I think you have a fair number of people who are older that remember it, and that's what I mean by living memory. And certainly, the Renner brand was extremely popular, not only in Youngstown but in the region. Mm-hmm. And the roots go back obviously to Germany. We're talking about Oktoberfest. George Renner Sr. came here as a teenager, escaping the Kaiser's army, like so many people. He came in 1848, a time of political turmoil in Germany. He settled in Cincinnati, which had a large German population and still has a large German-American population today. Became a brewmaster and taught his son, George Renner Jr., everything he knew. And that's where the story begins to involve Youngstown, because George Renner Jr. was extremely enterprising. He flipped breweries, I guess you could say, in modern parlance. He would find underperforming, poorly managed breweries, take them over, make them profitable, and sell them at a profit at that point. He did that in Zanesville and Worcester before learning, and everyone in their family lore who's involved in business always seems to have a tramp in the story. Okay. It tells them there's a place available in Youngstown. And the Warners have a similar story where a tramp directed a member of the family to Youngstown. But he made this aristocratic tramp, as they described him, informed George Renner Jr. that the City Brewery in Youngstown was for sale. And that was a very well-established enterprise. It was founded back in 1861 by a gentleman named Matthias Seeger. And he turned that into, as he had done with other breweries, turned that into a profitable enterprise.
Now, this was located just over here on the Mahoning River, right?
That was on Pike Street. That's where it's been that's where the site was for generations.
Right. So just kind of west of the Market Street Bridge over there.
West of the Market. It's no longer accessible.
On the south side of the river.
Right. It's no longer accessible. There was a period of time where you could get up there and you could see the remnants of the garage. Yeah. The brewery itself had been destroyed in the 1970s. I'm sorry.
Right.
But that's where it was located.
Right. Okay. So George Renner Jr. purchases the brewery, the City Brewery.
The City Brewery in the 1880s, and by 1890 he faces his first major crisis, and of course his son Emil.
So why doesn't he flip this one?
That's interesting. Yeah. I think I can only guess that it was more profitable than the remainder, and it may be that he found himself developing. He had a family at that point. So I think he was probably a little less restless.
Okay,
And he did have a substantial German-American community to plug into. He was an active member of St. Joseph's Church on the north side. And so I think there were many reasons that contributed to his decision to stay in Youngstown at that point.
Okay.
And Emil Renner would have been one of them. He had a son who was very actively involved locally. He was a sports star at the Rains School, actually a classmate of Billy Evans. Who went on to become the Hall of Fame umpire. And so I'm sure that they just became connected. I think that, you know, I once asked a gentleman named Joe Hill. I don't know if you remember Joe Hill. Joe Hill died at 102. He came here from Lithuania, a Jewish immigrant. I'm sure the name was anglicized, but he. I asked him why he stayed in Youngstown. He said, "Who knows?" He said, "I stayed here. I got to know people. Basically, he established a network, and I'm assuming the same process took place with the Renners."
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but they faced their first crisis in 1890 when the brewery blew up, and we all know that story. And Gib James.
That is a bit of a setback, sure.
That's a bit of a setback.
When your business explodes.
And not a pleasant childhood memory for Emil Renner, who was the son who took over the business. And I believe it was Gib James who related that story to a number of people about how Mr. Richter, the brewmaster, was essentially decapitated by the explosion, and Emil Renner apparently witnessed that, was knocked up against an ice chest, and fortunately was revived and got out of the brewery before the fire consumed the brewery.
How old would he have been about that time?
He would have been quite young because, and I can't give, I believe maybe around 10 years old. He was, to give you an idea, his the family housekeeper had taken him downtown to the Opera House to see Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Okay.
You know, so we can guess that he was a child at that point.
Yeah.
In any event, what's remarkable about that story is that they turned the brewery around. They got it back on its legs within a year. And that, again, is an indication that he had strong contacts and a strong network within the community. A friend in the banking industry gave him a low-interest loan. A malt salesman from Pittsburgh also provided a loan that essentially made it possible for them to reopen. And they not only reopened, they actually upgraded their business because they moved to bottles and away from the traditional kegs. So it became a more modern, up-to-date facility.
So they got a bottling operation.
They got a bottling operation.
Okay. Right.
So that was, and Spitz Renner is probably, a chapter could be written about Spitz Renner if anyone were to write a book, because he was a kind of a local character, a man about town, and the name itself is reflective of that. It's an abbreviated form of a Southern German slang term, Spitzelbub, which means rogue or devil, or, you know, but it's more kind of an affectionate term.
That's Emil's nickname.
That's Emil's
correct?
nickname, and it was given to him by the principal of the Rains School. So, you know, that's an authoritative
well, that
figure.
says something. It also says something who came up with the nickname
and why.
Yeah.
So he was apparently mischievous, and
Sure.
and even as an older gentleman, apparently wore his hat cocked to one side. So he was jaunty.
He's a rebel.
And physically active until he was quite old. So Spitz was one of the local characters. We had a lot of local characters in Youngstown, and Spitz Renner was one of them. He had to be very nimble, though, as a businessman, because of course he took over the brewery in 1914. Bad time. Right. It's kind of like Clarence Strauss taking over Strauss's department store shortly before the Depression. You know.
Right.
Spitz Renner found himself pretty much idled. The plant idled within a few years. They did make an attempt after Prohibition was enacted to produce a near beer, but I guess the process of removing the beer, or the alcohol from the beer, created this kind of burnt aftertaste, which nobody found appealing for obvious reasons. So that, for the majority of the of Prohibition, the plant was completely shut down. And the family had to rely on its real estate holdings, money from investments they had made in the local real estate market. They did reopen in 1933, and at that point, though, you know, first of all, big government contracts were given to a lot of breweries in Milwaukee, as we know. Right. So the other thing that kind of eventually hobbled regional family-owned breweries was the fact that flat cans were introduced. bottles became less and less common, flat cans were introduced, and they could be transported by trailer truck across the country.
Now, at the time, I think Renner was bottling in cans. Weren't they canning beer, but the cans were shaped differently? They weren't flat topped?
That was yes. What they did was which of course made them less marketable, less transportable, if that's a word.
Well, I guess why were they doing that? And
they
what
were
did
doing it
those even
because
look like?
they were kind of ungainly looking artifacts, if you've seen them, but they were produced that way because it didn't require an expensive revamping of the machinery. They could produce cans more or less in the shape of bottles.
I see.
But they obviously didn't have the advantage that the big breweries did, where the flat cans could be stored and shipped very efficiently.
Yeah.
And so that was a disadvantage, definitely. And then people, once those big brands that were heavily advertised became widely available in the area, people began to rely on the local brand a little less frequently than they had.
Sure.
So there was also, interestingly, a phenomenon called tasteless beer, which to us sounds absolutely unappealing.
What is the point of that? Yeah,
that's exactly right. Okay, and but when you think about it, the appeal of
tasteless cheeseburger. Oh,
that's
yeah,
exactly
sign
right.
me up.
Exactly right. Well,
right.
But the thing is, when we think about microbrews, we're getting something that's closer to a traditional European beer.
Right.
Okay, and it's hearty, and for some people that was bitter. For some people, that was a taste they didn't enjoy. They wanted something like a very light Pilsner. And
well, yeah, those American beers from, if you were drinking beer in the 70s or even like the 80s,
right,
it was going to be one of those Pilsners, and it was going to be very light.
Right.
And today, people almost look down on them a little bit.
Well, that's right.
The craft beer people, because they do lack flavor, I guess, comparatively speaking.
But it's like anything, like Wonder Bread when it came out was a phenomenon.
Right.
Now we want to get an artisan bread.
Yeah.
But I think that was obviously something they felt they needed to do, produce the so-called tasteless beer. But then again, that was a little bit of their identity gone. With the revamping of that, or retooling of that recipe. What really injured them, though, was the growth of the interstate highway and the interconnective highway in particular, which was an outgrowth of that. And of course, people don't realize that this didn't just happen because everyone wanted to run out and buy automobiles. It happened because the government made a decision to, in a way, subsidize the auto industry. I mean, we pay much less for gasoline. We're always complaining about gasoline. Anywhere else in the world, people pay a lot more. Our government has ensured that we pay a little less for gasoline by subsidizing the oil and gas industry. That was the end of mass public transportation, obviously, in most communities, like Youngstown, which had a streetcar system at one time.
So how did that affect the brewery?
That affected breweries because the trailer truck, because all of those big brands were coming into the community, and the interconnective highway had a very direct impact on. It may have been the last nail in the coffin because they were already struggling, and I think when they built the interconnective highway here in Youngstown, they got a little too close to the Renner property. And they damaged those big garages.
Okay.
And there was an $82,000 settlement, but within a year they were closed. So I mean that appears to have had an impact on their decision about whether or not to go forward.
What type of beer did they make?
Well, they had a variety of brands. I mean,
Okay.
I don't. That's one
Okay, I was
question
just
you stumped me
curious.
with right there.
No.
But
I
they
was
had
trying to stump you.
but they had their brands were actually Old Crown. The Old Crown Beer Company actually continued to market their brands from the 1960s until about 1976. And the brands don't come to mind, but certainly they would have come to the mind of anyone living here in the Valley because those would have been their go-to brands.
And what year did it close?
They closed in '62. And the family has continued to. I mean, people like Carl James, Gib James, continue to take pride in that heritage. A lot of artifacts from the brewery have been preserved within the family. Other people certainly have bottles, posters that were are part of our Valley history. But it is important to remember that what we're seeing today is part of a tradition. It's not an unbroken tradition, but we did have this tradition of brewing in the area. And that also was a reflection of our ethnic diversity. We did have a substantial German population, which tended to become less visible, after World War I. But which nevertheless is reflected in that brewing heritage.
717 Credit Union. Business services designed to meet your daily needs. Commercial loans, business deposits, merchant and payroll services. 717 Credit Union. It's knowing you were treated right every time.